Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. Thank you for being here today. I know you have a lot of choices. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. If you can, please take 10 seconds and drop a rating or a review on Apple, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you could share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds on your end can help me get better and help other Cub fans find the show. You can also now help support the CubsPS Plus podcast by going to cubspsplus.patreon.com. There are 4 support tiers that come with added perks such as access to a private Discord discussion group, access to bonus episodes, merchandise discounts in the merch store that will launch in the coming weeks, and the ability to submit priority questions ahead of time for interview guests and more. Your support will help me keep this podcast ad-free. Welcome into episode 39, making this the Andrew Chafin episode because, man, we sure could use him in the pen right now. With the Cubs licking their wounds after a losing homestand, yes, a losing homestand in spite of winning series against both the Mets and the Rays, the topic this week is missed opportunities. We all knew the Cubs had a tough schedule in the first half and would go through some rough stretches, but in order to survive those difficult road trips and top opponents, the Cubs needed to bank some wins against lesser teams, and they simply haven't done that. In this episode, I look back at the Cubs' record in both close games and in games where FanGraphs had them as a favorite, to highlight the opportunities missed and then discuss why they continue to lose in the margins, and why the series finale against Tampa was a microcosm of their entire season so far. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. So what a week. I don't even really know what to say. The Cubs started the homestand by beating the Mets 2 out of 3. Then things were looking pretty good. I was podcasting last week, looking forward to a Red series, hoping the Cubs could win a series, maybe even sweep. Unfortunately, they get swept. They really got blown out in all 3 games. And so things were bleak heading into the series against Tampa. But of course, in Cub fashion, the Cubs win the first 2. The first one with just an absolute Marcus Stroman gem, winning 1-0. The second, a team effort to win 2-1. Really good bullpen action that day. Then we go into game 3, and I'll get into more of that in a minute, but the Cubs lose a winnable game. And that game really just kind of encapsulated the Cubs season. So we've talked a lot about how this team raised the floor. This team got better. They added some star power. What we're finding out so far, and I've talked a lot about it on this podcast, is it's not been enough. It's not nearly been enough. And it's frustrating because we knew this was going to be a tough schedule up front. The Cubs are already done with the Dodgers. They'll be done with the San Diego Padres after this upcoming road trip. They've already played a bunch of tough teams. They've had a series with Milwaukee. They've played all the games against LA. They've played San Diego. They've played an improved Miami team. On and on and on. They've played Philly. Coming up soon, by the All-Star break, they'll have played the Yankees. They're done with Tampa. They got Baltimore coming up on the next homestand. So a lot of these teams are going to get out of the way early, and you knew that was going to come with challenge. You knew there were going to be games the Cubs would lose. So when you're looking at that kind of schedule, what you need to do is you need to expand your margin for error. You know you're going to take some losses now that maybe you're not going to take in the second half when the schedule lightens up and you're playing a little bit easier teams. But right now the Cubs have not done enough to bank wins, and really the Cubs have had a lot of missed opportunity, and that may be what I call this podcast episode. But when you look at the Cubs, we've talked about it. The Cubs are not good in one-run games. They're currently 4-11. They did get a couple one-run wins this week against Tampa, and then lost another one. They're 2-5 in 2-run games. So that's a 6-16 record for a team that's 7 under 500 in games that are eminently winnable. Now, that's 22 games. Nobody's going to expect the Cubs to go 22-0 or 20-2 or even 18-4. But if they even took each of those splits to, say, 1 game under 500, if they were 10-12 instead of 6-16, now we're talking about a Cubs team that's 3 games under 500. You're just a game or 2 out of first. You're hanging around. And what I'm afraid of with this Cubs team is getting too far behind. They could absolutely have a hot second half and come back and make up a lot of ground. And this is a very weak division. However, the Cubs, by not winning a lot of these winnable games, and we'll dig into the whys and the whats here in a minute, but with every day that passes, as Jed has said, like at some point it's no longer early. At some point, we're not in a position where we can just say, well, it's okay. The Cubs kind of split this one. They'll make that ground up later. They're going to go on this West Coast trip. They're currently now 7 games under 500, but they're only 4.5 games out of first place. So this division is still in reach, which is absolutely maddening. And the way they're playing, if they were in the AL East or the NL East, a couple of these other divisions, they'd be pretty significantly out of it, and maybe they'd be almost out of the race. But the Cubs now are going to go on this West Coast trip, and it's not going to be easy. I know the teams that they're playing out there maybe aren't playing their best baseball right now, but at some point San Diego is going to get right. LA is going to be tough to beat, and I think I'll have to look at the pitching matchups again, but I think they're on schedule to catch Shohei Ohtani in that series if everything stays on track. And then they play a Giants team that's pretty good. And so you go out west, you play those games. I think under most normal circumstances, hey, can the Cubs go out there, win 5, split the long road trip, come back home, have a home series, and go? They could. And that might even, in this division, maybe that's still good enough. But if they go 5-5 on this 10-game road trip, they're going to come home. They're still going to be 7 games under 500. They may not be any further out of first place than they are right now, the way this division's playing. But you've now taken 10 games off the schedule. And as this season wears on, you're taking games off the schedule. You're taking opportunity off the table. And the Cubs have just left a lot of winnable games on the table. And frankly, they're going to wind up regretting that. So when you break this down, I looked at it a couple ways. I already gave you the close game stats, but I went back through FanGraphs game by game and went with their win expectancy. And what was really shocking to me is in games where the Cubs were measured by FanGraphs to have a win expectancy less than 50%, so they are not the favorite to win that game, the Cubs are actually doing pretty well. They're 16-15 in those games. And that includes, some wins against LA, San Diego, a win against Milwaukee, the 2 wins against Tampa, just, a lot of good wins that they've had. They have had good wins against good teams. But when you look at the games where they have a win expectancy of more than 50%, where they are the favorite to win, the Cubs are 8-15. Yeah, I'll pause and let that sink in. They're 8-15 in games where they were the expected winner. Now, in those measurements, it's not a ton. It's not like all those games where the Cubs were 70% to win. It's a lot of 52-48, 53-47, that kind of thing. It's a lot of times it's based on pitching matchups too, and all the things that go into that. But when you look down this list, the Cubs are 1-4 against the Reds. They are 0-2 against Washington in games that they were favored. There was one game where Washington had a higher win expectancy. They're actually 2-1 against Miami. They won a couple games where they were not the favored team based on pitching matchup. But if you look a little deeper, it's even more than the 4 losses to the Reds. The Cubs had one game against Milwaukee where they were the favored team basically, and they lost that one. They had one game against the Dodgers where that was the game they were expected to win, and they lost that one. They had 2 games against St. Louis where they were expected to win, and they lost both of those. And then even in the Mets and Tampa series, while it's great to take teams like the Mets and Tampa and win 2 out of 3 and win that home series, in each series, the one game the Cubs lost was the one where they had the higher win expectancy. And the FanGraphs win expectancy is not a perfect stat. It certainly does not mean you're going to win. But it just setting up, those are games where you have some favorables going your way, and you need to take advantage of those. Now, I don't think with all those games, that's 23 games. Again, when the Cubs are favored, have the higher win expectancy, out of 23 games, they're not going to go 19-4. But they shouldn't be going 8-15 if they think they're going to be a serious playoff contender. So all that said, the Cubs have gone through this schedule, and they have given some of those games away. They've given a lot of those games away. And in this division, they don't have to flip a ton. If the Cubs had 5 more wins out of all this mess, they'd be 2.5 games better in the standings. They'd be 2 games out, and they'd be 2 games under 500. And that would be probably not a place we'd be thrilled about, but that's a place that would be kind of a fine place to be right now. Then they could go on the West Coast, hope for a 5-5 split, come home, get your wins, hang around, be a couple games out at the All-Star break, and then hopefully feast on that second half schedule. But this team, and we've seen it time and time and time again, when it looks like things are going to get good, when it looks like things can turn for the better, they don't. So I want to talk a little bit about today, with all this missed opportunity, why? And I'll start with the last game against Tampa. That series was incredible. I mean, Marcus Stroman pitched an absolute gem, absolutely shoved the ball down the Rays' throat for 9 innings. Just was totally dominant, and it was so much fun to watch. And then the next day, the Cubs got a good start, and they got good bullpen performances from several guys. We saw Merriweather, we saw Leiter, we saw Alzolay go out there for a 2-inning save, and those guys just shut the door. And it was a 2-1 win. Again, it was the most potent offense in baseball. And really for the entire series, even counting the 4 runs in game 3, over 7 games, you held the Rays to 7 runs. You faced the highest offense in baseball. And it's a Rays team that does not have a particularly strong bullpen on their own. Not like they typically do. Usually that's a shutdown pen if you have to do your damage against the starters. But this year that pen's beatable, and the Cubs just couldn't do enough. That's a series. Again, I hate saying the Cubs needed to sweep the Rays. I would never have said that going into the series, but the way those games went, that's a huge, huge missed opportunity and a huge, huge momentum turn. If the Cubs go in, even with the getting swept by Cincinnati, if the Cubs go out and sweep the Rays, we are all feeling so good right now. And all I've seen on Twitter since about the 7th inning of that game on Wednesday, yesterday, was just so much negativity. And I get it. I'm there for it. I feel the same way. And it's so easy. This team is so close. And it's so close, and yet it's so far away, right? It's game after game after game. They do this all the time. And, Jed talked about it in the offseason. He said good teams blow teams out. And they do. And they're not going to blow them out a ton of times. But the Cubs just are not having that many blowout games. And when that happens, that means you are putting that pressure on your team to execute in the margins every single day. And that just exposes all the flaws that you have as a team. So, I mean, you look at, if you go back and look at FanGraphs high leverage statistics, one of the lower performing teams in that category over the last decade is the 2016 Cubs. But nobody noticed because the Cubs blew the doors off so many teams so consistently. They didn't have to win in the margins all the time. Now, in the postseason, they had to, and they managed to get it done, although I think it probably took about 15 years off all of our lives in that World Series. But you can hide some of the flaws that way. Ideally, you have something that, they're kind of like 3 areas. In football, they talk about offense, defense, and special teams. In baseball, you've got the offense, you've got starting pitching, and you've got the bullpen. You can mask bad pitching with a good offense to an extent. You can mask a bad offense with good pitching to an extent. And the Cubs aren't really bad anywhere. I mean, they're above average offensively. They're above average pitching-wise. They are, if you break out starters, the Cubs are above average in a lot of starting pitcher metrics. And if you look at relievers, they're actually kind of right in the middle of all bullpens. So they are an average bullpen overall. They have like one WAR. They've got a FIP of 405 and an XFIP of 407. So they've not been particularly lucky or particularly unlucky. They've not been particularly bad. They've been fine. And fine is a relative thing. Sometimes fine is good enough and sometimes it's not. And then in this case, and we'll dive into it a little bit deeper here, but when you look at the offense, the Cubs offense overall, they're up in runs scored. They are, top third in WRC plus. They are performing fine as an offense on the whole. But when you dig deeper, you get into those leverage spots, things break down. And so when you have a team that's playing all of their games in this tight little box because you're not blowing teams out, because either your bullpen is not locked down or you're not getting enough runs across, you're exposing those weaknesses every single day. So let's dig into that a little bit here. And then we'll talk about in that game how that all manifested itself in the Rays game. So when you look at overall offensive numbers, the Cubs are 11th in WRC plus at 104. So they're slightly above average offense. You look at WOBA, and sorry, I'm kind of sorting these on the fly as we go. They're 10th. They're top third. If you look at overall WAR, the Cubs are 10th. So the Cubs are consistently, when you look at these measurements, they are top third. They're just barely bottom third on strikeouts at 23.9% rate, which is a little bit higher than what you'd want to see. But the Cubs I think they're third in walk rate. Let me check that here real quick. Yeah, they're third in walk rate at 9.9%. So the Cubs are walking, they're getting on base. But when you take that a little bit deeper and you look at, men in scoring position, the Cubs are 18th. They have a WRC plus of 98, sorry, I misread that. So they're kind of middle of the pack, just below middle of the pack. So let's change the filter a little bit. So let's go from men in scoring position to high leverage situations. And that's going to be your close and lights. That's going to be what we saw in the 8th and the 9th inning against Tampa. And when you look at that, the Cubs, if you just look at pure OPS, the Cubs are 27th. If you look at K rate, in those situations, the Cubs are middle of the pack. So they're not striking out a ton necessarily in those situations. But then you look at the WRC plus, and the Cubs are 28th in baseball at 67. So when they're in those situations, those clutch situations, and it seems like the team's not coming through, it's because they're not. And you can break that down. The Cubs have, as you'd expect, their better hitters are doing a little bit more. If you break the team down and look at the component parts, and we're in high leverage situations, Ian Happ is a 163 WRC plus. Mike Tauchman is 151. He's been great lately, so I hope I'm glad he's up to fill in for Bellinger while he's out. He probably should still continue to get some level of bats when Bellinger's back. Yan Gomes is 146. Edwin Rios, surprisingly, is 130. Luis Torrens was 120. But again, like those guys have 2 plate appearances. So, you do something once, and it really helps your numbers out. You look at Trey Mancini, 107. Eric Hosmer was 104, surprisingly. But who did we not hear on that list? We didn't hear Seiya Suzuki, who has a WRC plus of 70. We didn't hear Patrick Wisdom at 63. We didn't hear Nico Horner at 42. We didn't hear Nick Madrigal or Cody Bellinger at 23. We didn't hear Dansby Swanson with a 17 WRC plus in high leverage spots. Christopher Morel at negative 20. Tucker Barnhart, negative 47. Miles Mastrobuoni at 3. So guys are not getting it done in those situations. And so compound that, I talked about the pitchers here a second ago, and if you look at the Cubs relievers, like I said, you can go look at most of the stats that matter. They're pretty much league average in the bullpen. When you look, though, at high leverage situations, things flip. Pittsburgh leads baseball with a bullpen FIP of 2.42. They have an xFIP of 2.89, so maybe they've been a touch lucky, but not a ton. I mean, that's still the best xFIP in baseball, so they're still the best bullpen either way. But when you look at the Cubs, the bullpen's FIP is 633, and their xFIP is 502. So they've been a little bit unlucky, but 502 is still bad. I mean, let me sort that. But 502 is now, okay, their xFIP would have them a little bit better than Oakland. But that's terrible. And so when you put those two things together, you're in a close game late, day after day after day after day. and the offense is not coming through, and the bullpen is not getting it done. And you combine those two things, and that's how a 2-0 lead turns into a 4-2 deficit, or sorry, to a that's how you can blow a couple leads like the Cubs did against Tampa. So let's go through that Tampa game. So Justin Steele comes out, and he is just dealing. I mean, he was throwing so well. 9 up, 9 down, looked sharp, looked like Tampa had no idea what to do with him. And the Cubs got a couple runs early. The Cubs were aggressive. They got guys on base early. They stole bases. They got a couple hits in the first inning, scored 2, got up 2-0. And you have to know, I mean, the Cubs did pretty well hold Tampa down the entire series, but a team like Tampa, I mean, you look at the offensive numbers. Let me go back to this league chart. Full season WRC plus. Tampa Bay's at 134, and second place is Texas at 118. So, I mean, Tampa this season, and that was even more than that before the Cubs series, but they are almost 20% better than the second place team, let alone everybody else. Oh, sorry, about 20-25% better than the second place team. And so the Cubs had that offense. That offense is not going to stay down. You cannot just assume that team is not going to score anymore. And so, you get those games and you get in those situations. And so the Cubs got the lead. And then unfortunately, Justin Steele had to leave with injuries. So I'm kind of shaking out his arm. We heard after the game that Steele had some, I guess, throbbing in his elbow before the game and was trying to loosen it up. And then they were monitoring it during the game and just didn't feel great about it. So took him out as a precaution. I have seen reports today, and this is on Thursday, that the imaging came out relatively clean. I think it's expected that Steele's hopefully only going to miss 1 start. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully this really was precautionary. Hopefully this really is a minor thing. Anytime you leave with forearm tightness, it's very easy to think about those elbow injuries. I mentioned that with Brad Boxberger last week. I hadn't heard updates. I have heard updates that he started to throw, so hopefully that's promising that he doesn't have any major elbow injury. But we'll continue to monitor that. But so Hayden Wesneski, who was just recalled, came in the game, and Wesneski was fantastic. He looked like Wes Nasty that we saw in spring training. He took the game to the 7th. The Cubs were still up 2-0. The Tampa at that point only had 1 hit, and that hit was pretty questionable. There was a hard ground ball to Dansby that he had in his glove, dropped it, threw to first, almost got the guy out, but basically the runner was only safe because Dansby dropped the ball and they scored a hit. They were talking on the telecast before everything kind of melted down that the scorer might go back and change that to an error if it turned out to be the only hit. But so Wesneski came out on the top of the 7th. He got Harold Ramirez to strike out swinging. He got Isaac Paredes to ground out. And then he walked Manuel Margot. And so with Margot on first, he had a lefty coming up, and one of the controversial decisions, and we'll talk more about David Ross here in a minute, but David Ross made the decision to take Wesneski out of the game and go to Mark Leiter Jr. And Mark Leiter Jr. has been arguably the best arm in the Cubs bullpen this year, the most consistent. And he's also been the best against lefties. That split he throws has just been a lefty killer this year. He's gotten so many big outs against the left-handers. Now, if I'm in David Ross's spot, I probably don't pull Wesneski. He was looking really good. Leiter just threw the day before. Alzolay threw 2 innings. I'm going to try to get Wesneski through the 7th. And so I only have to deal with 6 outs out of what could be a tired-ish bullpen, given that the high leverage guys worked the day before. But he didn't. But I will say I thought it was a perfectly defensible decision to go to Mark Leiter Jr. You got a tough lefty coming up who's already seen Wesneski once that day. And so it's perfectly reasonable to go make that call. And it didn't work. But if we're going to judge a manager and make decisions on whether a manager should be fired or not, it's not just about the outcome, because I'm certainly not comparing Mark Leiter Jr. to Mariano Rivera. That would be stupid. But even the best closers come in, it's the 9th inning, it's save time, or it's the 8th and bases are juiced in a 1-run game, and you're going to go to your closer right then. Sometimes it doesn't work. Doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. And in this case, I thought that was a perfectly defensible decision. Now, unfortunately, Leiter threw a pitch that didn't move. It hung middle, and that's what happens. Brandon Lau hit it out. Brandon Lau's a good hitter. It was his 9th home run. And the game's tied 2-2. But the game's tied 2-2. Like, the game is not over at that point. And then he struck out Christian Bethancourt. So Leiter got out of that inning, 5 pitches, and the Cubs come up, and the Cubs push a run across. They actually were a little bit clutch in that inning. It was great. Trey Mancini hit a single. Unfortunately, he is just slow as molasses, and I don't know what that slide was, but he got thrown out at second base trying to make it a double. That hurt. That was the 3rd out. Mancini at first, not necessarily wheels, but it would have extended the inning and let another person come to bat, and then who knows what happens. But in that case, he did put the Cubs ahead, so kudos to him for that. And then they came back out, and I was fine with Leiter staying out there. But then after being a little bit shaky the inning before, he walks the first guy on 4 pitches. At that point, if I'm going to have beef with a Ross bullpen decision in that game, that's the point. You had guys up in the bullpen. You could have gone at that point. I probably would have pulled Leiter right there and move on. But he didn't, and Jose Siri hit his 10th home run, and now the Cubs are down 4-3. So they blew a 2-0 lead, and then they blew a 3-2 lead. And so Adbert Alzolay comes in. I don't know if I would have gone to Alzolay in the 8th, but they did, and that's fine. I mean, that's a perfectly fine place to go, because at that point, you kind of know you're not going to get too much more, but you hope you can stay in the game. And Alzolay gets out of it, and the Cubs come up. And then the last 2 innings is where you're kind of a little bit bad in both areas, right? Like, Leiter did not have his stuff, gave up 2 home runs and gave up 4 runs. Technically, 3 of them were, or 1 of them was charged to Wisniewski. But so you come up, and the Cubs start that inning. Miles Mastrobuoni, who, I'll take it. Send me your criticism. I mean, I talked about Miles Mastrobuoni last week, and I don't understand the Cub fans' hatred for Mastrobuoni given his small sample size and what he's done. But he's also not performing. So I understand it. I still don't understand why he gets as much hate as he does when, you want to look at and complain that Miles Mastrobuoni is, as a 3 WRC plus in high leverage situations. That's fine. But we walked through it, Seiya, Dansby, Nico. Well, so many of those guys are not getting it done either. So I don't understand the, having so much hate for Mastrobuoni, like getting rid of your 26th player and replacing him with a different 26th player on the roster is going to fundamentally change this offense. It's not. But it is entirely possible that Mastrobuoni is playing his way back down to Iowa at this point. We'll see where things go. But he had a good at-bat in the 8th inning. So he drew a walk, got on base, stole second, and then Christopher Morel came in to pinch hit and struck out. As, again, Christopher Morel, he's going to be streaky. He's going to be hot and cold. He's been cold lately, and he didn't start this game, and probably for good reason. I don't know that was a great pitching matchup for him. But when he doesn't get regular bats, he's probably even a little bit less reliable than normal. But then Nico Horner singles, so it's great. So now Mastrobuoni's on third. I did see some complaints about the Cubs not sending Mastrobuoni home on that one, but I thought, he was barely past third base, and Rosarena, who was an absolute cannon, already had a laser on its way into the cutoff man, which is a perfect strike. If Willie Harris had sent Miles Mastrobuoni on that one, Mastrobuoni would have been out by 30 feet. So it was the right hold. And then, there's 1 out, and you've got Dansby Swanson up. So you're feeling pretty good. Dansby's a guy who has a good reputation for being clutch. His career numbers are pretty good in leverage. So I'm hoping that what he's done this year is sort of just, some level of noise that will average out as the season goes on. As I talk about a lot, like people who get off to super cold starts, super hot starts, unless something has really fundamentally changed with their game, like they're a young player who's now is making strides, or they're an old player who is losing a step, losing bat speed, losing velo. For the most part, when a guy has kind of established a norm, you're going to typically play more and more towards the norm as the season goes. You might have a bad year, but if you're normally a good hitter and you have a really bad first month, you're probably going to tend to make it up later. So I'm hoping that's what happens with Dansby. But he struck out swinging. And then Ian Happ came up and worked a full count. Maybe it was 2-2. No, it was a full count. I'm pretty sure it was 6 pitches. And struck out looking. And it was a bad call. I'm torn on, it was where the pitch actually wound up was close enough to go protect with 2 strikes. But it was a sweeping slider coming from off the plate that never got all the way back to the plate. So, if Ian Happ, whether it's Ian Happ or not, if the batter reads that as being significantly outside, but then the ball has a huge amount of break on it, it's very easy to make the wrong call and see a pitch that you think is going to be 4 or 5 inches off the plate and then winds up 2 inches off the plate and you get rung up. But either way, that's 2 times, and Dansby in particular, not being able to make contact. At that point, I'm pretty sure Tampa did not have the infield in, but Miles Mastrobuoni's pretty quick. A lot of options there. Get a fly ball to the outfield, he can tag up. Get a ball the opposite way on the ground, and there's a good chance he's going to score. And then Ian Happ came up, and you don't have those other options, but put a ball in play, make the defense do something, and they didn't. And so 2 strikeouts, inning over, 2 men left on base, and there's 2 guys with chances late in the game to get a run in and couldn't do it. Nico couldn't get Miles in from second base, but he did have a single and advance him to third. So that's positive. I will take that 100 times out of 100. Then you go to the next inning, and the Cubs gotten a little bit of damage, but they were able to get out of it without a run scoring. So they come up in the 9th, and Seiya Suzuki flied out to start the inning, but then Mike Tauchman drew a walk. He's had some really good at-bats lately, and one thing I really like about him is he seems to have a really good plan when he steps in the box, and he gives you a competitive, competent at-bat pretty much every time I can remember seeing him. He's had a lot of hits. He's gotten some walks, but he'll make a pitcher work. He'll run up 5-6 pitches on the pitch count and be competitive. And then they bring in Edwin Rios to pinch hit, I think just hoping he'll run into one and get something up and out. But he got hit by a pitch, so now it's first and second. They got a runner in scoring position, and again, 1 out. And then you got Patrick Wisdom's up. I'm not going to nag on him too much. I mean, there really was an error. There was a ball was fielded by Isaac Paredes at third base and just made a bad throw to second base. So there was basically a defensive miscue in there, and everybody was safe. And so he didn't get a hit, he didn't drive in a run, but I'll take it. Again, like I was talking about with Dansby Swanson, he put the ball in play and something happened. And so now they come up and you got Miles Mastrobuoni up with less than 2 outs, and you got bases loaded. So you've got options. You've got hit a ball the other way, get something to the outfield, whatever. And Miles is a guy who does walk a lot. He has huge walk numbers in the minor leagues, and he's had a pretty good walk rate in the major leagues so far. And he worked a count deep. He got to 3 balls. He swung at a 3-1 pitch that was up. It was borderline. I think it was going to clip the zone. Probably wasn't the pitch he's really looking for, 3-1 though. So, if you take it, who knows, maybe they call ball 4. And then unfortunately on 3-2 he chased. So, for the people who hate Miles Mastrobuoni and say he's not good, that at bat certainly did nothing to change anyone's opinion. And then we get Yan Gomes up, and Yan Gomes, worked count, battled in there, hit a ball hard, but it was, a very catchable line drive to left field, and game's over. So when you look back at it, the last 2 innings, with a runner in scoring position, late in the ball game, Christopher Morel, Dansby Swanson, Ian Happ, Miles Mastrobuoni, and Yan Gomes didn't get it done. That's 5 guys with a shot. That's 0 for 5 in the last 2 innings of one single game to not get a run across. At the same time where one of your primary relievers did not have a good day. And maybe something could have changed. You can rethink those decisions, and hindsight's 20/20. Some people I'm sure will still tell me that they absolutely thought Wisniewski should have stayed in. And like I said, I would have left him in. But then if Wisniewski gives up the home run to the lefty, who's already seen him once that day, people probably aren't as mad about it. But then you're just looking at people saying, well, they had Leiter ready, and Leiter kills lefties. Why didn't they bring Leiter in? And so you can rethink those things. I don't like to litigate too much based on outcome. I like to think a lot more about the process, the point in the game, how the flow's going. Sometimes playing it by the book, by the numbers is absolutely the right call. Sometimes you have to pull in a little bit more feel. But in the end, I think the most important thing is you make competitive decisions. And part of the issue, I talked about this last episode because Jed made a comment about it, is he doesn't see a lot of this being on Ross because he knows that there are flaws in the roster. And one of the challenges is right now, David Ross, not only is the bullpen not performing, but the guys who he would consider the circle of trust is really small right now. I mean, Michael Fulmer started there. He is long gone out of the circle of trust. Jeremiah Estrada has had some moments, and they're starting to give him some leverage situations, but he's not all the way there. And there are some things about him that are worrisome. He's walking too many guys, and when he does have a huge strikeout rate, north of 40%, which is great. But when he gives up contact, he's giving up a lot of hard contact. So when you can start combining walking guys and hard contact, there are going to be some games where it's going to be a disaster out there. And you look around, Michael Rucker got sent down. Brad Boxberger's been hurt, but Boxberger's been terrible. Just on and on and on out of the bullpen. I think the guys he trusts right now are Edward Alzolay, Mark Leiter Jr., and Julian Merriweather, who a lot of fans wrote off after just had a horrific first outing where he gave up 5 runs in 2/3 of an inning. And then I think it was his third outing, he gave up like 2 more runs. So his ERA was torched on his first 3 outings. But he's been quite good since then. He's throwing hard. He's getting a lot of strikeouts, a lot of swing and miss. It's been a nice addition to the bullpen. Now the Cubs, well, we'll see what happens with Justin Steele. Hayden Wesneski may have to make a couple starts. But they brought up Wesneski to be in the bullpen. Now, I don't know exactly how they plan to use him, whether it's going to be in sort of that piggyback long role so they sort of keep him stretched out, or I think one thing the Cubs are looking at right now is just trying to increase arm talent in the bullpen. You look at some teams like Houston, Atlanta, the Dodgers were doing this for a while. They just have, it seems like a stable of young arms come up every year, and they just got guy after guy after guy that's got velo and movement and just filthy, nasty stuff. And the Cubs haven't had that. They have not had enough swing and miss. I talked about it with Greg Huss a few weeks ago. I've talked about it on my own. They don't have enough of those guys. So when you're in these close and late situations, your offense has maybe scored a couple runs, you're in the ball game, but you can't necessarily count on them to, get another 1 or 2, get some of that insurance late. And you basically have to be perfect. And if you are not swing and miss stuff, then, you're relying on even a softly hit ball. That freaking Red series, they did hit some smashes, but there were so many balls in that series that just were little flares over second base, little ground balls that, just between the infielders they couldn't get to. It just felt like the Reds were basically pounding the Cubs with paper cuts. And that's what's frustrating when you're not getting enough swing and miss. So the Cubs are trying to up their arm talent. They've brought up Wesneski, Rucker's down, and when you look at the minor leagues, they're taking some guys like Daniel Palencia, converting them to relief, promoting them to Iowa, and you've got some big arms that are going there. But again, like Jeremiah Estrada just has filthy stuff. Like if you look at his actual stuff and the rating on his pitches, it's great. But he's not quite putting it together yet, which is big picture. That's okay. He's a young player. He's got time. I'm optimistic he's going to get there. But in this bullpen right now, when the Cubs have, frankly, used up a huge amount of any margin for error that they had coming into the season, it's a tough time to hope that a young guy is going to have it. Hopefully somebody will, and hopefully the Cubs are getting to that point over the next year where they do just maybe have arm after arm after arm. Daniel Palencia, Luke Little, Cam Sanders is still down at Iowa, but he's big strikeout rates, lost swing and miss, but he's also walking a ton of guys, so that's worrisome. And the Cubs have another couple guys, Vinny Natoli, who we saw in spring training, and Tyler Duffy, who both pitched well and both have June 1 opt-outs on their contracts. So the Cubs now have about 48 hours to decide whether they're going to pick up those guys or they'll have the chance to opt for free agency. And my guess is they'll take it. opt-outs go in for a reason. These are guys who think they can pitch at the big league level, and they just want a shot. And so they, made the minor league roster out of spring training. They've pitched well, and the Cubs can go or not. And I don't have a strong opinion. Like, Vinny Natoli in particular has had a lot of swing and miss rate. Duffy has as well. I haven't looked at his numbers quite as recently as Natoli's. So I'm not saying the Cubs have to pick these guys up, because the Cubs are also in a position where the 40-man roster is, while we can all say whether or not we feel it's as talented as it could be, the 40-man roster is getting more and more filled by young guys that the Cubs, I think, want to keep around and have some promise for. So the Cubs are already going to have to move somebody off the 40-man roster when Cody Hoyer is ready. He is eligible to come back. He was supposed to pitch. I don't know exactly what the timeline is. It wouldn't surprise me. He probably has about another week. I'd have to go back to when he started his official rehab. When he started rehab assignment, you got 30 days to finish it, and for the major league club to activate you. I think the next 7 to 10 days that's going to hit. So somebody will have to go, but it's certainly not going to be Edward Alzolay. It's not going to be Javier Assad, unless Brad Boxberger does have a more serious injury and goes to the 60-day IL. He's not going anywhere. You can't DFA a guy while he's on the injured list. Ben Brown's in AAA. You're certainly not going to cut him off the active roster. Nick Birdie's out with his appendectomy. You look up and down this roster, and maybe they decide they've seen enough of Michael Fulmer. I still think he's probably fixable, whether it's by the Cubs or by somebody else. But I could absolutely justify taking Michael Fulmer off this roster and moving on. I think he'll pitch reasonably well for somebody later in the season, but honestly, I can't expect the Cubs to just wait on that forever. Looking further down the list, earlier in the season, I might have said Julian Merriweather was a candidate, but absolutely not right now. I mean, he's one of the best arms in that bullpen. Maybe Michael Rucker. He's had his struggles. I've not largely been a fan of Michael Rucker, but he did have a stretch earlier this season where he was looking pretty good, and I was starting to come around on him, but he's been pretty rough lately. Then you go to the position player side, and maybe they move Tucker Barnhart. I think the challenge with Barnhart is, well, he can't hit, but he really could never hit. So the Cubs are getting exactly what they signed. I know he's frustrating a lot of fans, especially on days when you have maybe Mastroboni and Mancini and Barnhart all in the same lineup, or Hosmer back before the Cubs cut him loose. But he is a good defensive catcher. He's a good game manager. I mean, he caught Stroh's gem the other day. He caught the last game, so he was catching Steele going 9 up, 9 down. He caught Wisniewski through that game. So I mean, he's a quality game caller back there. But you do have Miguel Amaya just tearing it up in AAA. Now, the one thing I will continue to say on Amaya is he's not had a full healthy season since 2018, so I don't know what kind of load he's going to be able to manage this year and stay healthy. But as long as he is healthy, he needs to be getting number 1 reps. He has missed so much time. So right now, if the Cubs are going to bring him up and stash him and have him start 1 or 2 games out of every 5, he's probably better off in Iowa. But he showed when he came up here, he didn't put up massive offensive numbers, but he hit the ball hard. And he, did a good job with the pitchers. He had Kyle Hendricks raving about him from his time throwing down in Iowa. So I don't think Tucker Barnhart is somebody that the Cubs are going to cut at this point. And it's kind of dangerous to not go through 3 catchers. If Amaya comes up and struggles then, or Yan Gomes gets hurt, then you're kind of fishing off the scrap heap for catchers. And that we saw that a couple of years ago. That's just a total crap show. But looking, there are probably no position players unless the Cubs work a trade somewhere. No infielders the Cubs are going to drop. Even if you hate Miles Mastroboni, he's still got option years left. He's a guy who's hit at every level of the minor leagues. I could absolutely see the Cubs sending him back down to Iowa, but I don't see them DFAing him. Especially, I've seen complaints this week. Like last year, by the end of the season, everybody was wondering why Zach McKinstry was getting so much run, so much playing time. He didn't hit with LA, he didn't hit with Chicago, but like Miles, he had hit everywhere up through the system. And now that he's getting a chance to play every day, and maybe there's something about the Cubs' approach. He made a comment about the Cubs wanting him to pull the ball and drive the ball more, and Detroit's just kind of letting him do what he's always done naturally. maybe there's something there, but he's having a great season in Detroit. So I don't see Miles Mastrobuoni in his 55 plate appearances at the major league level and say definitively he's not going to be able to play. Now he's 2 for his last 30 something, so there's only so much you can maybe put up with. But I don't think he's a guy who's going to get DFA'd. Mike Tauchman was somebody who was probably a risk, but the way he's playing, I think you keep him around as the 4th outfielder. Edwin Rios, actually, he's really listed as a DH, but DH third baseman. He's probably a guy who's very much at risk for being DFA'd. So there are a couple spots. So when you look at guys like Natoli and Duffy, you're moving 2 guys off. You're going to have to move a 3rd guy off to get Hoyer in. And maybe that's okay. Maybe they can do that. But then you also, at some point, if they want to bring up Daniel Palencia, they just have to look at these things and decide, is Natoli or Duffy or both worth it to get them up right now and see what they can do. And then again, like they could bring these guys up. If they go have 2-3 bad outings and you need a spot for Hoyer, maybe you cut one of those guys then. The Cubs certainly did that some last year. But these roster decisions are getting tougher because, there are just a number of guys on the 40-man roster that you're keeping because they're prospects and because of the Rule 5 risk that they ran over the last couple off seasons. Nelson Velazquez, Brennan Davis, Alexander Canario, Kevin Alcantara, Miguel Amaya, Ryan Jensen. A bunch of these guys, Ben Brown, they're not going anywhere. They're not going to get cut to clear space. Those guys get snapped up in a second. So, what the Cubs do, we'll see, but the Cubs have got to get better in the margins. Now, some of this, the Cubs may benefit by some regression to the mean because most of these hitters have better career numbers than what they're showing. But there's also a kind of a mental factor to it too. And I remember when I was talking to David Da Silva in the offseason, like there's a point where guys press and they get out of their normal routine. They don't, he talked a lot about staying in the moment. And when the whole team is struggling like this, when it's consistently in close games, you're just not pushing that extra run across, and the bullpen is maybe not holding that 1-run lead or keeping that game tied to give your offense a chance to win it in the end. There gets to be, there's a lot of contagiousness to it. Hitting, I've always believed hitting is contagious from the youth level when I'm coaching 7-year-olds all the way up to the big league level. Like you start seeing a bunch of guys hit, everybody's loose, and it's a good approach at the plate. You've got pressure on the pitcher, and things go the other way, and everybody's tensing up a little bit. Everybody's pressing. I think they have a bunch of pros. I don't necessarily think there's a problem in the clubhouse, but I'm sure the clubhouse is tight. And I don't know, it's kind of David Ross's job to figure that out. But these guys just need to hit. And when you get down and talking more about David Ross, when you look at these choices, there are some limitations. He only has the guys he has in the bullpen. There's Mariano Rivera is not there. Craig Kimbrell is not in that bullpen. Andrew Chafin, David Robertson are not in that bullpen. And we can all do the, Jed should have signed Chafin. He should have signed Robertson. He should have gone after whoever. The fact is right now he didn't. So when David Ross is in a tight game, and it's day after day after day, he has to go down that bullpen, and they know who's available, who's not, but he's got to make a decision. And a lot of times he's making a decision between a bunch of guys who've shown that they're not getting it done or not getting it done consistently enough. Or he's having to pull in a guy that he probably knows he's worked a little bit too much over the last 10 days because those are the only guys he trusts in those situations. I mean, I've seen, why are you going to Michael Fulmer, but it's the 5th inning? That's not a tight and late situation. You're not going to go to your closer in the 5th. There just aren't a lot of good choices. And then the lineup construction, there have been some oddball lineups he's put out there for sure, but you still need to rotate guys. Actually one of my bigger complaints with Ross this year has been that the 2 guys at the bottom of the bench in terms of position players just aren't getting playing time. Like we may not see Edwin Rios for 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden they're going to call on him to pinch hit with the bases loaded and 2 outs in the 9th. I don't want to say it's not fair. It's his job and it's fine. But if a guy is not getting regular work, you don't just keep that timing. Like, you need some level of work. And maybe Rios isn't a guy who's going to get 2 starts out of every 5 games, but once a week, maybe he starts. Maybe he pinch hits 2 or 3 times during the week, and it's just not happening. And so I think I think Ross is kind of cutting off his own options to some extent that way. But then with the roster construction, like, you know, you do your best with it, and based on who's available. One thing we don't know is when, like when the Cubs were in Houston and Christopher Morel didn't make that catch that led to the Astros getting 4 runs off Jameson Taillon in the first inning of that game. You know, Christopher Morel was in left and Hap was DHing that day. And Ross said after the game that, you know, Hap said he needed to at least, you know, get off his legs for that day. Like, these guys feel their bodies. Nobody is healthy by the second half of the season. I talked about it with, you know, last fall, one of the first guests on my podcast was Chris Fasami, who's a hitting coach here in Charlotte, who played for the Rockies organization. He's a big, strong guy. He's a big dude. And he would tell me how, you know, he would come into the season not out of shape, but he would come in with kind of some extra bulk because over the season, you're just not going to sustain your weight. You're going to drop a few pounds. By the middle of the season, a lot of guys are switching to a little bit lighter bat, take an ounce or a half an ounce or an ounce and a half off the bat. Again, to keep that bat swing up as your body gets tired. So these guys need that work. I mean, I know Dansby Swanson plays basically every day, and Nico Hoerner's pretty close, and that's fine. But not every guy is built that way. And sometimes I could argue, you know, maybe over the last couple of years, maybe Dansby Swanson should have sat a little bit more. Now, he's not going to sit a ton. He's not going to sit a game a week. But, you know, maybe playing 150, 155 as opposed to, you know, 160. Maybe that helps him stay just a little bit fresher. But when you're going to do that, that means the lineup is going to change. It means you're going to have a day without, say, a Suzuki. You're going to have a day without Dansby Swanson. Or you're going to have a day with, you know, Nico Hoerner as DH, kind of get him off his feet. Play somebody else at second base. That's a way to get those bench guys some at-bats to stay fresh. Ross has probably had a few too many of the let's get 3 or 4 of those in one day sort of thing, especially on days where it's going to be Tucker Barnhart's time to catch and you've sort of got one offensive hole in the lineup already. But the other thing, too, that I don't think is getting quite enough attention when you look down the numbers I read through, there are professional hitters and professional pitchers on this team that just are not getting it done enough. And I'm sure that they would be the first. I'm sure Dansby Swanson would be the first one to tell you that he needs to deliver more in those situations right now. I'm sure Nico Hoerner would tell you the same. Like, those guys are pros. They work hard. They know what they're doing well, and they know what they're not doing well. But at some point, like, it can't be all about David Ross all the time. You know, I'll see that, well, I see the lineup construction, and the Cubs are going to lose today. And maybe they will, and maybe the lineup construction does or does not play into that. But there are still 9 guys who are going to go up there and bat 3 times each, unless they're subbed out, that have opportunities against their major league hitter. They are major league ball players playing against major league pitching, and they've got to get some stuff done. And sometimes you don't have your best arm available in the bullpen. Sometimes your best bullpen arm may come in and just his stuff is not moving that day and doesn't have it, walk a couple guys and you got to pull them out. And it's on whoever comes up next to just get it done. I mean, nobody is going to get it done all the time. Even the best players in baseball have crappy days, go through slumps, get lit up for a while if they're a pitcher. But you got, as a team, you got to figure it out. Like, you know, guys who are going good have to make up for the guys that aren't going so good. The starters who are in the lineup maybe have to make up for the fact that, you know, one of your better hitters is out that day. And the Cubs are not doing enough in the margins. And I don't know at this point. I mean, this division still sucks. I mean, David Ross last week saying that, well, I guess it's a good thing we're playing in a division where everybody's playing shitty. Pardon the profanity there, but that was his quote, and that's it. I mean, if the Cubs were in the AL East behind Tampa, they'd be just miles out of first place. But they're 4.5 out, and they're hanging these games. Now, they're going to have to just continue to rework that bullpen. I see a lot of calls for trades. Trades are tough at this time of year because you look at, especially with the expanded playoffs, that third wild card, you've got a couple divisions that are just mostly garbage, the central divisions. The AL East and AL West are super strong. Some other teams in the National League, the Mets and the Padres aren't performing the way people thought they would. So there are a lot of teams still kind of hanging around the fringe of the playoff race. And, if you've got a tradable asset, there are absolutely going to be guys on the trade market. But right now, if you're kind of hanging around in a lousy division and teams aren't really ramping up the trade talks yet, it's not the point where you could be talking very actively with 4 or 5 teams to try to drive a price up on, say, a guy like Aroldis Chapman, who's kind of having a rejuvenation in Kansas City. Like those guys just aren't really available right now unless Jed calls up and overpays. So there's not a lot you're going to be able to get through trade. And so you watch the waiver wire. Maybe there's maybe a team is making a mistake cut and guy's off to a slow start. Maybe the stuff is still there and they're going to DFA him and you have a chance to claim him on waivers or try to get him as a free agent. There are a few of those guys. You can work within your own system. I think that's why they're brought up Wisniewski to be in the bullpen. That's why they moved Luke Little and Daniel Palencia out of the starting rotation to the bullpen to try to use their live arms to try to make the Cubs bullpen better. So they'll get some additions that way. They can continue to play in the margins with the bats. Nick Madrigal is scorching AAA. Now, Miles Mastrobuoni, when he got sent down the first time, went down and posted a WRC plus of 157 when he was down in AAA. So just because Madrigal was struggling in the majors, and again, like we've talked about his, he had a WRC plus of like 64 when he got sent down, and he was hitting 247. I mean, Nick Madrigal does not walk. He does not have much power. So for Nick Madrigal to have good value at the major leagues, he has to be hitting over 300, and he wasn't even close. So they sent him down. He's hitting over 500 in Iowa right now, which is great. I love to see it. I knew the Cubs wanted to send him down to go get those everyday at-bats and get his bat going. So maybe he comes up, maybe you flip him with Mastrobuoni, and you're making a trade-off there. Like Nick Madrigal is going to make more contact than Miles Mastrobuoni, even though Mastrobuoni doesn't have a terrible strikeout rate. But he's not going to walk hardly at all, and Mastrobuoni is walking quite a bit. So you're making a trade-off there. You're also getting a little bit less versatile of a glove. Madrigal's best position is second base. He can play third. He can play a borderline adequate third base, but arm strength is his biggest limitation. If you get those plays down the line where he's moving to the line, his momentum is taking him away from first base. He doesn't have the arm for that throw, and it's a long throw. And he's just not going to be able to put enough on it consistently to make that play. And maybe that's a trade-off you make. If he's hitting 330, that's a trade I'll make. I'm going to give up a little bit of defense down the line, but he'll be competent mostly over there. He's not a guy that can play in the outfield. Maybe you don't need that. Maybe you roll the dice with Tauchman as the fourth outfielder. When Bellinger comes back, Trey Mancini can theoretically play a little outfield, but the way he's moving these days, I don't know how great of an option that is. But there's not that much more at Iowa right now that's ready to come up. Brendan Davis is not off to a good start. Velasquez has been hitting pretty well, but he's struggled when he's been up in the bigs outside of, he did have that one grand slam. But again, we're talking about guy number 23, 24, 25, 26 on the bench. That's only going to move the meter so much. If Miles Mastrobuoni goes down and Nick Madrigal goes back to get those at-bats, you're going to have the difference between Madrigal and Mastrobuoni across, 15, 20 plate appearances a week, max. That doesn't fix that, Dansby and Seiya and Nico and Wisdom and Mancini and all those guys are not getting it done in high-leverage situations. So I don't know what the answer is, really. I mean, the Cubs have a roster that is theoretically good enough to compete for this division, and they're still competing for this division. But the more and more games they give away, the more opportunities they lose by losing 4 out of 5 to the Reds and getting, losing a couple games to Washington and getting swept by Miami and, just all this stuff and taking games that are theoretically more winnable against teams like the Mets and Tampa and LA, and those might be the only game you lose in the series. Like, those games are fine. Like, nobody's super mad that the Cubs didn't sweep Tampa. Like, I don't think we expected I was hoping to come out of that series with 1 win as well as they've been playing. But it still is so frustrating to end that, especially the way that series ended, that being the last game. You know, if they do that in game 1, coming off the Red series, like, oh, here we go, more of the same crap. But then if you get the 2-1 win and then you close on like Stroh's great game, then hey, we just won 2 in a row against the Rays. You know, still missed opportunity in game 1, but you know, we finished stronger. So we just often end on this down note as we go into the next series, and it's frustrating as a fan. It's frustrating to have to. I don't have to go out and read Cubs Twitter, but I do because, you know, I don't know, we all do, and we like torture. But you know, it's not fun to kind of end those series that way. It kind of sucks the joy out of looking ahead to the next series. But I'll continue to watch. I'll continue to be optimistic. I still think this is a team that can go on a run at some point. The starting pitching has been very good. Right now, hopefully they're getting to a point where they have a little depth. Hopefully Steele doesn't miss many. Hopefully Steele does only miss the 1 start. Kyle Hendricks has looked pretty good coming back. Wisniewski looked really good the other day. So if Wisniewski can plug in for Steele, hopefully Tyone can get back on track. Got some things here. We got Ben Brown throwing really well at Iowa, and he's probably getting close, like in the next big pitcher injury, or if Tyone can't figure it out and has to go to the bullpen. You know, Ben Brown's maybe the next one up. Caleb Killian has had some really good starts since he got sent down. If you're not following Alex Cohen, the voice of the Iowa Cubs, go do it. He tweets out a lot of really interesting and useful information, informative information about the Iowa Cubs. But there are arms there, so there is talent. It's there. I think, you know, obviously this was a team that we didn't expect to compete for the World Series, but they should be better than they are. So with that, let's look ahead to this next 10-game road trip. Hopefully the Cubs can go 6-4, 7-3, surprise us. You know, like I said, you know, in games where the Cubs come in as the FanGraphs underdog, they're 16-15. So they're holding their own against the good teams, which frankly makes this really frustrating. Like if the Cubs were just flipping a few of those games, I mean, they're 15-16 against those teams. They had 2 games against Texas where they were favored to win because Texas got off to a bit of a slow start, but Texas is tearing it up right now, and the Cubs beat them 2 out of 3. You know, Seattle's a team that's probably going to be in the playoffs, and Cubs beat them 2 out of 3. So the Cubs can hang with the good teams. They just got to take advantage when they get opportunities, and it does mean that they're going to have to compete against the good teams now, because the more that they use up this margin for error, the more that you lose 4 out of 5 against the Reds, and you get swept by Miami, and you lose 2 out of 3 to Washington. You drop a couple games against St. Louis that you shouldn't lose. You've got to make it up somewhere else. It means you're going to have to make it up against the good teams. So now the Cubs are going into a stretch of the season, like now through the All-Star break. The schedule's going to be tough. I think there are a couple weak teams in there, but not many. It's a lot of good opponents the rest of that schedule. And the Cubs are going to have to do some damage there. They just are. If they're going to stay in this race, if they're going to make a run at the Central. I mean, looking ahead, they've got 4 in San Diego. They've got 3 against the Angels and 3 against San Francisco. That's a 10-game road trip with no days off. Then they come back home, and we'll see how Pittsburgh's playing. They got off to a super quick start and then really came down to earth hard. But they've got 2 series against Pittsburgh, sandwiched around a series against Baltimore. Baltimore is really freaking good. Then they've got St. Louis, and they've got them in London. And then you come back home and you get Philadelphia, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and the Yankees to close out the rest of the first half. That's not going to be an easy stretch. I mean, through those games, I would have to check on Cleveland. Cleveland is not as good as they should be this year, but with the exception of St. Louis, basically everybody in that run is 500 or better. And those are going to be good teams. And if the Cubs are not in a position where they can just win 40% of those and be okay. You know, like I said at the top of this episode, if the Cubs go out and go 5-5 in this road trip, there's still 7 games under 500, and there are 10 games left on the schedule, or 10 fewer games left on the schedule for them to make up ground. So it's getting to be go time. And this is a team that is in a kind of a tightrope situation with regard to the trade deadline. I think it would be a really, really bad look for the front office if the Cubs are major sellers at the deadline. And the Cubs are going to have some things to sell if they want to go that route. I mean, Cody Bellinger, I think, was signed basically to either succeed and benefit that he's having a great year or sell at the deadline. And he's had some ups and downs, but on the whole, he's been largely really good for the Cubs. Hurt his knee making just a ridiculous, fantastic catch in Houston. Got caught in that stupid chain link outfield fence that's just beyond ridiculous. Marcus Stroman has an opt-out in his contract, and the way he's pitching, there's probably a very real chance he's going to take it. Now, he's talked about wanting to be extended with the Cubs, and I think it would make a lot of sense to do it. It seems like he wants to be here. He's obviously still a high-quality pitcher. He's a little bit older, but, they could tack on 3 to 4 years on the back end of that contract, give him a little bit more money, and you just have a nice, maybe he doesn't have to be the ace, but he's going to be a good number 2, number 3 for easily the next 5 years, I think. Kyle Hendricks, if Kyle Hendricks comes back strong, he's got a team option for next year the Cubs may or may not take, but he becomes a tradable asset. So, Patrick Wisdom might have some value as a bench power bat for somebody. I mean, I would hate to see the Cubs sell off this team again. I mean, Jed, when this all started with the Yu Darvish trade and he got a bunch of teenagers, he made the comment that it was not, the age of those players was not indicative of what he thought the timeline was to come back to win. Well, they sold off in 21, they sold off again in 2022. And if they sell off again in 2023, basically they're on the Owen Casey timeline. And it's just a bad look. I understood that they had to move on from the old core. I think we've rehashed that too many times. And it sort of made sense. I think having to move on from this group year after year after year, the Cubs need to be building towards something. And you want to play in the top free agent space, you got to be able to convince those guys that come that they're going to win here. And the Cubs need to spend money, and the Cubs have spent money. We could argue whether they should spend more. I think next year we'll see them go over the CBT threshold. I still think there's room if the Cubs can recover where they could actually add pieces this year and push closer to the CBT this year. But if you're going to go play in the space of trying to get Shohei Ohtani, and I know a lot of people just say that's pipe dream, but I think there's a path forward if the Cubs can do things right. Now, at this point, again, margin for error is so small. But if you're going to try to make a serious play for Shohei Ohtani, he has said that he wants to win. And he would be leaving a Angels team that, despite having Mike Trout, despite having Shohei Ohtani, and despite having a couple other guys, they just don't win. Like, Mike Trout hasn't been in the playoffs since 2014, 2015. And Shohei's never been there. So if you're trying to make the case, and the Cubs were able to sell Dansby Swanson on it this year, but if they go through another sell-off, I don't know what the odds are that you're going to make the case to Shohei Ohtani that you're a serious, contender in the next couple of years. Now, he's going to sign a long deal, so it's a little bit more than just what are you doing in the next 2 years. But he'll probably sign for, who knows? I think before last offseason, I thought he'd probably go for 8. I think there's a little bit of hedge on longevity in that contract based on how long you project him to be, a starting pitcher and going deep in games. But certainly for the foreseeable future, for the next 5 years, next 6 years, barring major injury, I mean, that's a guy who's going to be prime pitcher, prime hitter, and worth every penny. So I don't know if teams are going to be willing to go 10 years on him at those rates. But, certainly 8 years. So the window to win is longer, and the Cubs certainly have a lot to sell, 2024, 2025, 2026. But again, we're talking about prospects. We're talking about Pete Crow Armstrong and Owen Casey and Kevin Alcantara and Alexander Canario and guys that look really, really good. And some of them are putting up some huge numbers in the minor leagues. But Matt Mervis is putting up massive numbers in the minor leagues, and he's struggling like hell right now. And Miles Mastrobuoni, who I like more than most of you do, has hit at every level of the minors. He has not hit in the major leagues. And there's just no guarantee on these guys. So I think the Cubs have enough of those guys that I think some are going to hit. I think there are also enough guys that you can work some trades and then bring in some supplementary pieces. But there are no guarantees. The Cubs just have to get better. Guys have to do their job. Ross probably has to clean up the decision-making a little bit. Jed has to work at the margins, see how he can make this roster better. But when push comes to shove and we've got Dansby Swanson up with men on base in a tie game, or we're down 1 and there's a run there to drive in, got to at least move the guy around. Got to at least put a ball in play. Give yourself a chance. And right now the guys aren't doing it, and it's all in the margins. We talked about at the top. This team, you look statistically, they're pretty good offensively. They're pretty good pitching. Even if you break the pitching up, they're pretty good with the starting pitching, and they're pretty average with the relief. And if it was average relief across the board, if they were putting up average numbers in leverage situations, this team would be a lot better off. It'd be at least a few wins better, maybe more. But you combine, poor leverage offense with poor leverage pitching, and you play a crap ton of 1-run and 2-run games, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get these stretches where they can beat a good team a couple times and then inexplicably get swept at home by the Reds. So that's enough for today. Hopefully the Cubs can get something done on this road trip. Otherwise, we may have another, not so fun conversation next week. Thank you for joining me today. If you liked the discussion, or maybe especially if you didn't, please drop a rating and review wherever it is you get your podcasts, or tell a friend about the show. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all at CubsPS+. And check out the Patreon page, CubsPSPlus.patreon.com, to help support the show and keep it ad-free. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!